So in this topic, we look at observing variability. And the next few topics in this course is all about focuses a lot more on variability. So here we discuss observing variability, and to do this, we look at the Indian cattle data as our case study example. So as always, back in topic 1, we have more information on this data alongside a paper, which kind of came with this data, and the paper digs into this a lot more. But as a brief overview, this case study is a survey which was in Bengaluru in India. This is a major city in India which has experienced fast urban growth. And one of the aims of this case study is to investigate the effect of urbanization on dairy population. So, observing variability. What does this mean? So, to observe variability, we visually examine a data set to gain an understanding of how the data points look and how they relate to each other. Effective visualizations allow us to visualize the variability within the data. For example, box plots, histograms, scatter plots are fantastic ways that we can observe the variability in our data through visualizations. And these sort of plots that were outlined back in topic 3 on visualizing multidimensionality. Now, you have another set of plots like bar charts, which more display a summary statistic rather than allow us to visualize the variability within the data. A bar chart will just show how many people are in different categories. That's less helpful when we want to visualize this variability than, say, a histogram, where we can see how spread out the data is, how much it varies across that variable. Or similarly with a box plot, how much the box plot varies across a variable. So in this case study, we're going to focus on the following variables, which I'll outline in a second. But the variables that we've chosen and those kind of definitions behind them and these information behind them is given to us from the paper. So we've got PSSI. This is a variable which is categorized into 3 levels: urban, rural, and rural. We have whether the farmer sells to a dairy cooperative. And as the paper outlines, it calls this a formal indirect method. We have whether the farmer sells to a middleman, which the paper calls informal indirect, and whether they sell to a direct market, informal direct. And then for individuals who have sold to these places, we have the price paid per litre of milk in Indian rupees. So we have the price paid at the dairy corporation, to the middleman, and to direct marketing. That's the price paid per litre of milk. So we're going to examine first. We're going to observe variability. And one way to do this, and a fantastic way to do this, is by looking at box plots. And so here we're looking at our box plots, and we're looking at the price sold per litre of milk in Indian rupees, or the price paid per litre of milk in Indian rupees, to our 3 different places. But we've split it by whether it's formal or informal. And we chose this because that's what they did in the paper. And we're just trying to look at, okay, how did they come to that conclusion in the paper? So we've got here R2. So we've got the box plot showing the price for our 3 PSSI types. So we've got urban, rural, and rural. And we've got a box plot for whether it's formal, which is our dairy cooperatives, or whether it's informal, which is our middleman or the direct market. And we can see that there's a variability in price by consumer type and by the PSSI type. Now, the kind of observations that we're making at this stage, because we're just observing, are more subjective. That's because we're not doing any kind of formality here. We're not doing any measurement here. We're just merely observing. And so whether that actually means anything or whether it's just randomness, we're just using our intuition at this stage. But let's have a look at the median. So that's this big black line in the middle of our plots. If we look at the median for our informal prices, if we look at the median price per litre of milk in Indian rupees, the informal channels tend to be highest at urban and lowest at rural. So here we're observing that the median tends to decrease as we move from an urban region to a rural region. We can see that the mean price is very similar, however, when we're looking at formal between these three regions. However, looking at the median doesn't say the whole story. We can look at that kind of whole variability in there. We can see that this informal channel has a much larger variability than a formal channel. And this is clear because of how these box sizes change. Our formal channels have much smaller variability. They do not have they do not have a big difference in them between the bottom price and the top price, or between the different quartiles. Whereas our informal channels have a lot more variability in them. From these hypotheses, we can start to gain insights. So these hypotheses can be formed by observing the variability in plots like this. For example, an informal channel has a much larger variability than a formal channel. Why might this be? Well, this could be because an informal channel incorporates both middleman and direct cooperatives, but formal is just a dairy market. So if we remind ourselves back here, we have that formal is just one dairy cooperative, and informal is middleman or the market. Well, hypothetically, as a hypothesis that we can say at the moment, maybe it's that our lower values in our informal channel is for middleman and our higher values are for a direct market. And that's why we see this huge variability in here. We're not sure. But we can observe and we can create these hypotheses. Perhaps we should then try splitting out this informal channel further to separate out this variability and observe a little bit more. We can also see that we are also looking at here at the variability between the 3P SSI types. And so if we look at this informal consumer types, the variability actually changes throughout these 3P SSIs. The variability is much smaller for urban, rural, informal streams than it is for urban. Why is this? Is this due to less data, more data? Is this due to that we're only looking at middleman and we don't have any directs in here? Is this because we only have direct markets here and we have no middleman? And so forth. So kind of we can really observe and gain these insights by questioning it at this stage. And now we've kind of done some observation, we can now dive in a little bit more. So let's instead, on our x-axis, instead of looking at formal and informal like they do in the paper, let's now look in a bit more at just dairy, direct, and middleman, our three different consumer groups that we had. Now, dairy is the same as formal, so we don't see any change there. But for our informal, it's now split into direct and middleman. Well, this kind of shows a little bit more, actually, of what was happening before. We don't have any middleman for urban, rural, or rural. We only have middleman and urban. Now, that might be indicative of how things work in more urban places, is that a middleman's more common there, whereas in a rural place, you have your direct markets and you have your dairy. Perhaps this makes sense, and so there's not much we can do about that. But while we focus on urban, on how we've split this from direct into middleman, we can see that this variability, which was for urban and informal, which was very spread out, it's actually still spread out, but we've explained it. We've accounted for some of it. We can see that actually the middleman of that informal price for urban, those lower values were actually coming from the middleman price, and those higher values were coming from the direct price. That makes sense, because if you're going to sell to the middleman, they're presumably then going to sell on. If they're going to sell on, they still want to make a profit. So if you sell to the middleman, you might sell it for cheaper to him, because then he can still get himself a profit when he sells it. Whereas direct, if you're selling it directly, you might have to do more resources for that, and you don't have to pay someone else on the way. If we also now look at this, then if we look at direct, we can kind of observe our variability and see, okay, this explains a little bit more. So before we had that for urban, our informal was really varied for urban and for rural, but for urban rural, it wasn't varied as much. And now that we've split out our middleman, we can see, oh, actually, we can see this kind of trend of the direct price looking like it's decreasing as we move from urban to urban, rural to rural. This being said, rural still is incredibly varied, has this large variation between, what, 20 rupees and 40 rupees for direct, which is very interesting and something else that can be dug into. Why might this be? Is this to do with how much milk is sold? Is this to do with, is it that if people in rural are selling directly, that if they're selling a lot of milk, they sell it at cheaper? And so there's different kind of hypotheses that we can then form from here while we're observing our variability. Perhaps this kind of middleman and direct can be split into more specific groups to help explain a bit more when we're observing these changes. But anyway, to conclude overall, these plots, such as kind of ggplot2, those plots that we've seen here, are really powerful ways that we can visualize the variability within a data set, because they allow for these multiple dimensions to be explored. To observe variability, we visually examine a data set to gain an understanding of how the data points relate to each other. And we achieve this through different data visualization techniques. This step can be subjective. You may interpret the data differently based on your own thoughts and biases as well. You might have looked at this and thought, well, there's not really much change for the informal. Or you might have looked at this and said, well, there's not much change between the formals. And you know what, that's something that could be completely argued. Maybe there's not much data points in these formal bits, and that's why they're all pretty similar. And if there was more data there, they'd be exactly the same. It's this subjective stage at this point. But while subjective, this stage is useful to gain initial insights into the data. Patterns, outliers, and trends may be observed, and hypotheses can be made for further analyses. Thank you.